Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to our Thursday morning briefing series. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my pleasure to be chairing this morning's briefing. Today, we are looking at North Korean troops supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We are looking at risks and dangers in the Indo-Pacific, and we are looking at the broader security links between the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic theaters. According to intelligence reports from the US, South Korea, and Ukraine, up to 12,000 North Korean troops have been deployed to Russia since late October. Last Friday, Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang to discuss further military cooperation. South Korea initially debated sending weapons to Ukraine in response, though public opinion is widely opposed. Then came Tuesday's events with President Yoon's decision to impose martial law, although that had, above all, a background in domestic political division over inequality, housing prices, and economic prospects for young people. But of course, instability in South Korea will hardly help the Western goal of building a reliable coalition in East Asia. China, meanwhile, has remained cautiously silent about North Korea's involvement in Russia. But of course, there are worries about Beijing's next moves and about potential Chinese interference elsewhere. In mid-November, we might remember the Danish Navy detained a Chinese-flagged bulk carrier on suspicion of having cut two undersea cables in the Baltic, one between Finland and Germany, the other between Lithuania and Sweden. And the Finnish, Swedish, and German authorities have launched investigations. In short, then, the military ties among Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are deepening. And we want to ask today what this means for regional and global security, and how does it affect German and European interests? To discuss these questions, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. First up will be Dr. Andras Raj, who's Senior Research Fellow at DGAP's Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. Andras has previously worked inter alia at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki and the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs and the GMF. He focuses on Russian foreign and security policy and defense questions and is a regular guest on this morning briefing series. Thanks for joining us again, Andras.
Thank you. Good morning.
Next will be Dr. Evan Laksmana, who's a senior fellow for Southeast Asia Military Modernization at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS. He's also the editor of the Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment, an annual strategic dossier launched at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue. Prior positions included positions at the National University of Singapore and the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, Indonesia. Although I just learned that Evan was born in Germany, he does not speak any German, and we're still very pleased to welcome you.
Thanks for having me.
Finally, last but not least, Dr. Aylan Matle is a senior research fellow in the Center for Security and Defense here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. She was previously deputy head of the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Jerusalem. She focuses on German and US security and defense questions, NATO and transatlantic security and defense relations, as well as the interconnectedness of the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific theater. Aylan has a paper out, came out in September, on the security risks in the Indo-Pacific, which my colleagues will be happy to share in the chat. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks in a second, and then we'll open up for questions after about 25 or 30 minutes or so. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and when invited to speak, introduce yourself and keep your questions relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all of my colleagues here at DGAP supporting this briefing series: Henning Hoff, Milan Nitsch, Julia Lever, Ibke Evering, Helga Beck, and some others. Now, without much further ado, over to you, Andras, for a military update on the situation in Ukraine, and especially on the deployment of North Korean troops. What difference does it make? Over to you, Andras.
Thank you. Good morning again, and thank you for joining us today morning. When it comes to North Korea's military contribution to Russia's war in Ukraine, one needs to see that the troops are not the most important elements. The troops have the most visibility, particularly since they arrived to Russia. But when it comes to the overall Russian war effort, the delivery of artillery ammunition is way more important. North Korea is far the largest supplier of Russia's artillery ammunition. Estimates vary about the amount of artillery ammunition delivered. Numbers vary between 5, 6, or 6.5 million shells. This is equal to more than a year of Russia's artillery shell production. In a war that has been lasting for 2.5 years, the North Korean shells constitute a massive contribution to the Russian war effort. In addition to artillery shells, and here artillery means not only like howitzers, but also missiles, mortar shells, small arms ammunition, and a number of other things. North Korea also contributed to Russia's war effort with a limited number of ballistic missiles. These are the KN-23s. The first ones have been sent to Ukraine, to Russia against Ukraine sometime in the end of last year. The first combat deployments have been documented in the beginning of this year. So far, around 100 such ballistic missiles have been sent. Based on open source information, approximately 60 of them have already been fired, so some still remain. These ballistic missiles are not particularly advanced, so they are not equal to Russia's best weapons. They are somewhat comparable to the Russian Iskander missiles. From time to time, people even mix them up. But still, they contribute to the Russian effort of overburdening Ukrainian air defense and hitting cities and other targets, particularly in the eastern part of Ukraine. Compared particularly to the ammunition shipments, the approximately 10, 11, 12,000 troops are unlikely to make much difference. In this war, since April, Russia has been losing more than 1,000 soldiers a day. Since September, the Russian daily losses, the average daily losses are around 1,300, 1,400 per day, equaling 2 entire battalions every day. In such a tempo of attrition, such an intensity of attrition, 10,000 absolutely unexperienced troops will make little difference. Besides, there are major interoperability problems on the Russian side when it comes to how to communicate with the North Koreans, how to fit them into the Russian C2 structures, so command and control structures. There are problems also in the level of officers coordination. So one shall not perceive the North Korean deployment, at least at the present scale, as something that would be decisive. From this deployment, Russia profits mostly politically. So Moscow can demonstrate also to the domestic public, not only internationally, but also to the domestic public, that Russia is not alone. See, Russia has allies fighting on her side. The profit is clearer on the North Korean side. First, the North Korean army hasn't seen high-intensity fighting since the end of the Korean War. So the North Korean troops deployed to Russia, and not only the infantry and special operations, but also the military advisors. And there are plenty of military advisors. Some have already been killed, actually. So North Korea is gaining live combat experience, learning basically how modern war looks like. And they are learning it on a hard way. There have already been a few cases, Ukrainian artillery hitting North Korean troops because they are absolutely unprepared for fighting in an environment when the battlefield is saturated by sensors, drones, and the like, and detection is immediately followed by a long-range artillery strike. So they have a lot to learn. So the one profit they gain is learning, and the other is, of course, finance, money. Based on South Korean intelligence information later confirmed also by the Ukrainians, Moscow pays roughly $2,000 per month after each and every North Korean soldier, meaning that financing a contingent of 10,000 North Koreans, it costs around $20 million per month. Financing 10,000 Russians, contract soldiers, particularly taking into account the sharply raising money that Russia pays for the new contract soldiers, financing 10,000 of them, it would cost something between 800 million and 1 billion per month, meaning North Koreans are a lot cheaper. So far, we haven't seen large-scale combat deployment of North Koreans, but according to various sources, their combat training or interoperability training is soon coming to an end. meaning that deployment is likely to take place very, very soon, possibly already in the upcoming days. Again, one shall not overestimate them. Their main importance is political. Overall, the main contribution of the North Korean war, of North Korea to the Russian war effort is ammunition supplies. Bad news, there seems to be no way how the West could interrupt or even limit the amount of ammunition flowing from North Korea to Russia. They will just keep sending ammunition. Thank you again. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Andras. Before handing over to Evan in just a second, allow me to ask a brief follow-up question. You mentioned the problems of interoperability and the actual impact of North Korean troops in the short term, at least. But perhaps you could say a word about what to expect in the mid to long term. Is there some sort of strategic military alliance evolving that might have more of an impact in future conflict if these armies share combat experience over a longer period of time?
There is a lot of unknowns here. So one needs to be careful with the assessment because of really serious interoperability problems ranging from different standards of training, different experiences of military service, and very different weaponry. I think the most important dimension of the deepening military cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang is, from the North Korean perspective, is the technology transfer. Because Russia has been ready to transfer and already transferring advanced air defense technology, satellite technology, missile technology. I'm not qualified to assess to what extent Russia is helping the North Korean nuclear program, but it is clear that they are helping with missile technology and satellites. So in the longer run and from the strategic perspective, this is the most important dimension, and also something which would affect the entire regional security in East Asia. In Ukraine, their troops won't make much difference. Pyongyang has a lot to learn from this war. And of course, there are gossips about North Korea possibly sending 1 million troops, but this is more information warfare than reality. Russia has really serious interoperability problems. They are actually experimenting how to fight together with the North Koreans. Some North Korean units are used separately, so it's in separate detachments. In other Russian units, they integrate the North Koreans in, hoping that by literally fighting side by side, this would help interoperability problems. This is that Russia is also experimenting. They have no experience whatsoever in fighting side by side with troops coming from an entirely different military culture. So they will have a lot of hardships to counter. Thank you.
Thanks, Andras. I'm sure this North Korean move didn't go unnoticed in East Asia. So, Evan, handing over to you. Can you tell us more about the repercussions on the Indo-Pacific theater and security questions more broadly?
Thank you, John, and thanks for having me. I guess I'll just be very brief and sort of look at the broader strategic picture, not just in Northeast Asia, but how that ties with Southeast Asia as well. And I think this Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia ties has implications to how we might think of what's happening in Europe as well. But first, let me say that the bigger picture question, I think, for both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia remains very much the U.S.-China cross-domain strategic competition as sort of the primary backdrop. But I think the three key sort of shifting pieces strategically, I think, and how this fits with what was discussed earlier in terms of Russia and North Korea is, I think, first of all, there is a sort of shifting strategic geometry in both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. Number two, that there are, I think, growing risk around domestic political situation, as we've seen in South Korea, but that's actually not unique to South Korea. That's actually growing across the region as well. And third is sort of the unsettled nature of strategic policy in response to both U.S.-China strategic competition as well as these regional security flashpoints in Northeast and Southeast Asia, whether it's in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. On the strategic kind of geometry across Northeast Asia, certainly the growth in North Korea and Russian collaboration is part of China, Russia, North Korea and Iran in terms of broader collaboration. Of course, as noted before, these collaborations aren't exactly based on shared deep values or shared warfighting experience, but certainly the sense of pragmatic, tentative anti-West opportunities and needs, I think, certainly has driven many of these areas. But I think all sides are aware of the risk of entrapment from the other side. There's no deep reservoir of trust in that sense beyond that they can be relied on each other as a way to challenge the West. So that part, I think, is certainly growing. But what's also growing in Northeast Asia is the trilateral arrangement as well between US, Japan, and South Korea. Now, whether or not this potential institutionalization of the trilateral arrangement between Japan, South Korea, and the US will last, given what we've seen in Japan. There's a much more weakening domestic leadership, and certainly what happened in South Korea over the last 2 days is certainly going to be quite strongly felt across the alliance as well. Reports have suggested that the U.S. were not really aware, and U.S. forces Korea were not aware of the troop movements during the 6-hour standoff. So in that sense, I think what the U.S. calls the lattice work of alliances is certainly growing alongside the other side, which is the collaboration between China, North Korea, and Russia. As this is happening, I think what is difficult for Southeast Asia is, sure, China will always do what China does in South China Sea. But what is different now, I think, is the diplomatic decoupling between the Philippines and the rest of Southeast Asia, between Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So when you have these two different dynamics on the Northeast Asia front and on the Southeast Asia front, I think this is where you get the two risks I mentioned earlier, which is the domestic political transition that we've seen across Southeast Asia. 7 or 8 out of 10 leaders in Southeast Asia is basically about a year old on average, and there'll be more coming up. The nature of civil and military relations, I think, certainly is quite unsettled. It's not really settled in Japan for different reasons. It's not settled in South Korea for different reasons. But across Southeast Asia, you actually see the return of the army domination across domestic political spectrum as well. We see this in Vietnam, certainly, under the new leadership, in Indonesia, certainly as well, under the new leadership. What this means is that the return of the army domination across Northeast and Southeast Asia, I think, is creating this skewed world view over strategic and geopolitical risks that's very much dependent on the ability of domestic stability to be put first and foremost. So issues around interoperability and defense relations is still very much viewed to outdated concepts and doctrines from the 1950s and beyond. So when you look at these multiple risks across Northeast and Southeast Asia, around the changing strategic geometry, the domestic political transition that actually brought back older worldviews and leaders, and the return of the army, and sort of the unsettled nature of strategic policy making, especially between foreign policy and defense, I do worry that the so-called Indo-Pacific theater is a lot less coherent than it's being presented elsewhere. That it's not just about China, that it's not just about managing flashpoints, and it's not definitely about abstract notions of rules-based order. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Evan. There are a lot of follow-up questions that come to mind, but first I want to hand over to my colleague Ailen to help us make sense of the connections between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic theaters, but also to help us make sense of it from a German perspective, since we are at the German Council on Foreign Relations. A lot of what Evan was talking about is far away, but might not be so far away after all. So over to you, Ailen.
Indeed. Thanks, Jan. Thanks for the invitation and also opportunity to contribute to this very interesting discussions. As much has already been said by my co-panelists in regards to how both regions are increasingly growing, intertwined by ways of North Korean troops fighting alongside Russia, but also North Korea supplying Russia in terms of ammunition. as well as, one might add, allegations directed at China about the country's involvement in providing lethal drones to Russia, to point only to a few examples. I would like to further merge both theaters in my very short remarks, which I would like to structure in 3 very quick steps. Firstly, I would like to outline why the Indo-Pacific region, as incoherent and diverse as it may be, as Evan has already pointed out, matters to Germany at all, and why it is in Berlin's interest, especially in the next government's interest, to contribute to the security and stability in and of that region. Secondly, I would like to suggest how Germany can achieve exactly that. And then finally, I would like to point out why and how European NATO members should brace for an intensified quest on part of the US to focus Europe's, but possibly even the alliance's attention on the so-called China challenge. So first, on paper, Germany has admitted to the growing relevance of the Indo-Pacific, also to German security in 2020 already, in the so-called policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific, taking into account the security risks emanating from that region, while calling for deeper security relations with democracies and partners that share Germany's values in that region. However, the definition of these sort of like-minded partners remains vague, and the security policy coordination with democratic partners, especially with regard to Taiwan, is insufficient and lacking in detail. Now, especially the situation surrounding and regarding Taiwan should be of particular concern to Germany. Why? The economic impact of a military conflict and or confrontation between China and Taiwan alone would be enormous, eclipsing by far that of the coronavirus pandemic and the renewed war on Ukraine combined. So the costs of a military escalation for the global economy are currently estimated at about 10 trillion US dollars. And for Germany, which conducts over 20% of its trade in the Indo-Pacific, such a scenario would admittedly have catastrophic consequences. It is thus in Germany's very apparent interest to prevent a further erosion of the so-called rules-based international order, and also to contribute to the security and stability in that region. And that brings me to my second point, the how. How could Germany achieve exactly that? While Germany's military resources are admittedly limited, it can nevertheless contribute to at least attempting and trying to deter China, and thus preventing a potential military conflict. Increased attention to and also clear condemnation of China's activities coming from many countries, not just from the US, as has been the case for and partners in the region, as has been the case for many years, could change the Chinese calculus. Primarily symbolic engagement, such as the passage through the Taiwan Strait on part of Germany this year, and an increased number of joint military exercises with countries such as Japan, South Korea, or Australia could also have a deterrent effect on China. Given their shared challenges and also shared, at least in most parts, values such as democratic principles and the freedom and security of navigation, which are increasingly and on a very regular basis being tested by autocratic regimes in both regions, Germany should demonstrate and try to demonstrate unity with partners, with the partners that I've listed earlier, and adding also the Philippines, indicating its rejection of any change to the status quo, such as the enforcement of unlawful territorial claims by military means. Germany can also provide security support and cooperate more closely with these partners in terms of the defense industrial base in both regions. The cooperation between Poland and South Korea, for example, on the procurement of military equipment shows and highlights that such cooperation also directly strengthens Europe's security. Just as a footnote, Warsaw's planned acquisition from South Korea include, among other things, main battle tanks, but also multiple rocket launch systems. These suggestions and examples of cooperation already at play showcase the growing links and their rationale, which will and should, I would like to add, in all likelihood increase, given the nature of the interconnectedness of the threat landscape both regions are faced with, but also due to expectations that will very likely come out of Washington going forward. We already saw an increased push on part of the US during the Biden presidency to connect allies from both regions more and more, and also a sort of push for both allies, for US allies in both regions to pay attention to security and defense concerns in the respective other region, and also to contribute more to the security and stability in the other region, respectively. Now, we will, in all likelihood, see an intensified effort under Trump to focus Europe's, including NATO members, attention on China and how to deal with the country's increased malicious actions, not only in its own neighborhood, but also in Europe. Europeans should consequently be prepared to have a plan at hand how to respond to American calls to toughen up on China, especially in case if Trump is trying to condition the support of Ukraine, but also European security at large, and linking that policy fields to European approaches towards the Indo-Pacific at large, and China in particular. Mm-hmm. And with that, I will hand over. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alan, for your initial remarks. And I'll come back to you in a second, but let me invite everyone from the audience to come forward with comments and questions. Prefer to be in person by raising your hand or the virtual hand on Zoom, but feel also free to post questions in the chat. And while you come up with questions, let me ask a brief follow-up to Alan, because on your second point, the how Germany can respond, you mentioned already a couple of ways in which Germany is doing joint exercises, also supporting partners. You mentioned in your paper equipping the Philippine Coast Guard with unmanned aerial vehicles, etc. So I'm wondering, to what extent can Germany support its partners in the Indo-Pacific theater while also maintaining support to Ukraine in times of extremely tight budgets at home? Tricky question, I guess. And another follow-up question for Evan. You're currently in Singapore, if I'm not mistaken, but you're also travel the world. You're in London frequently, and so I'm wondering to what extent have European decision makers realized the full complexities of security questions in East Asia, and is there sort of some homework to do in capitals like Berlin and London when it comes to these questions that we're discussing today? Let me start with Alan and then hand back to you, Evan.
That is a sort of $1 billion question. However, I think it is there are ways to achieve what you just asked, by ways of prioritizing, by ways of putting more money where Germany sees increased security risks emerging. And I think while I would from my vantage point, I would not argue that the most important security and threat lies in the Indo-Pacific for Germany. It is obvious that Germany should be focusing on Ukraine and also on helping Ukraine succeed, and also on sort of bolstering the eastern flank in Europe. I still think there is value in making the argument, as we've just also heard earlier from my co-panelists, that both regions are more, that we cannot pick and choose. Whether we like it or not, the threat from the Indo-Pacific, especially China, but also North Korea, is not only coming to Europe in the future, it is already there. Which is why I think, especially in coordination with other Europeans, Germany could muster the strength and also the resources to contribute in more significant ways to security and stability. For example, by ways of coordinating more closely in terms of defense procurement and defense production.
Mm-hmm. Evan, over to you.
Thank you. Very fascinating, and thanks, Eileen, for those thoughts as well. I think what's interesting about both Germany as well as European engagement for Northeast as well as Southeast Asia. But let me, I guess, speak a bit more on the Southeast Asia part. I think certainly. First, it's not clear if European leaders understood the challenges of their defense engagement, in particularly in this part of the world, in a couple of different ways. First, I often find it when I engage with European policymakers coming to the region, particularly defense and foreign policy officials, I don't think they often do their homework. So a lot of the policy questions and discourses tend to be abstract and broad-based rather than very specific to the issues that the region has been grappling with for the last few decades. It's as if nobody has asked them this question before, when in fact we've been grappling with it for a long time. So the knowledge base, I think, of Southeast Asia, to be honest, and some parts of Northeast Asia is actually pretty low among European officials that come to the region. Second, there is a small but potentially growing perception that European defense engagement smells like tokenism. Let me do stuff in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia so that the US will help us in Europe. There's a bit of that. I think the perception, because the form of engagement once every year, once every 2 years, doesn't really change the strategic equation on a daily basis. Despite what the French says as them being an Indo-Pacific power, even their engagement is very much focused on arms sales rather than actually changing the strategic equation. So in that sense, I think the perception of occasional tokenism, I think, comes into play. The third, I think, challenge is what I consider as potentially strategic overcrowding of engagement. Keeping in mind that when Southeast Asian states host European engagement for visits, exercises, etc., these come with resources. And Southeast Asian states don't have a lot of resources to spend with on these hosting and exercises and all of that. So if the exercises are not meaningful for their operational proficiency, then they're just doing it just to be a good host. And so this transition from an inclusive architecture to what is essentially strategic overcrowding, because we have to deal with the Germans, French, Italians, not to mention the EU also. So without any clarity on the differentiation of added value of each of these different European engagements for the operational needs and proficiency of the Southeast Asian states, then it's just fine, we'll welcome everyone. But does it meaningfully change the strategic equation? I'm not entirely clear. So I do feel there's a bit of going for the sake of going. And then when you add in more complicated questions around Ukraine and Gaza, it gets even more complicated, I think, in the last few years to take European defense engagement with serious operational value for the region.
Thanks a lot. There's a question in the chat by Hans-Johann Schmidt about the role and function of countries like Australia and India related to the security questions in the Indo-Pacific. There is also a question by Johanna Krah, who is asking about Germany's export dependency on China and how likely it is that German politicians will be willing to face the current issues. She is commenting that Western politics is too short-term oriented and therefore the long-term threats seem to be readily ignored. What scenarios, she's asking, could deliver the wake-up call? Can I also throw in a question for Andras? Coming back to what you said earlier about the political value of North Korean troops in Russia, to what extent do you think that Russian President Putin is actually dependent on political support from anywhere? Might this very explicit way in which North Korea is contributing now have effects of other countries joining a more explicit coalition of Russia rather than just the tolerating that we've seen in many parts of the world? Right, I don't see any other questions for now, so perhaps let me send some of these questions in Evan's direction, and also the question for Andras. Do you want to go first, Evan?
Sure. On Australia and India, I think that's an interesting question. I think for Australia, certainly with AUKUS being part of the alliance, it's pretty much strengthening Australia's alliances with the US, perhaps even at the expense of Australia's sort of lesser than alliance defense relationships with regional countries, particularly in countries like Indonesia, who continues to view Australia as the deputy sheriff of America. So I think the trade-off for Australia that's difficult now, that I think is not yet resolved, is between growing its defense ties with the US to the point of not even interoperability, but even interchangeability, particularly on advanced platforms like AUKUS and others. At the same time, restoring economic ties with China, what the current administration calls stabilization, and of course, at the same time, growing its Southeast Asian engagement, particularly to Indonesia and ASEAN. And I feel like these three trends are sort of self-contradictory in that sense. And I don't think the current Labour government over the past 2 years have sort of figured out how to do that yet. But certainly in terms of the defense sphere, the investment in terms of exercises, hardware, the export control stuff over AUKUS and others, that's certainly going into one particular direction of providing that deterrence by denial capability with the United States as the key anchor. So in that sense, I think that's going to be Australia's main role moving forward. Now, India, I think, is where things are even more kind of interesting. In the past few months, we see, for example, sort of the restoration of the issues around the border at Ladakh. So is this the beginning of India finally improving its relationship with China? I think is certainly something worth looking forward to, because the premise of India's growing ties with the United States over the last few years has always been because India finally figured out that the bilateral engagement alone was not sufficient to stabilize its relationship with China. And so when things go bad in the border and it needs that additional security ties with the United States, whether it's nuclear, new advanced technology, and others, I think is certainly a part of India's response. But I think the worry is now, because of post-Ukraine, kind of India's relationship with Russia, I think is an important feature of that effort to potentially balance things out between the US, China, and Russia, is a game that I think they've played before. I don't know if they want to repeat this game again. But India's focus, I think, is still very much in the Indian Ocean side of the house. Their concern around their own, what they see as their sphere of influence in the Indian Ocean region, is still fragile, particularly because of the political transition we see in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, and others. So that, I think, the neighborhood focus of India will still very much be in the minds of Delhi, as opposed to much broader to the Northeast Asia or the Southeast Asia theater.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll hand the question about export dependency, German export dependency on China, to Eileen in a moment, but let me bring in Andres first. And of course, this goes for all of our panelists. Please feel free to react to the other panelists' comments as well. So Andres first, and then Eileen.
Thank you. So trying to answer the question, to what extent Putin is dependent on political support from anywhere, it's not dependence in the democratic sense. So he doesn't have to win elections, how we mean elections here in Western Europe. Yet still public support does matter. And we know very exactly that the Russian regime measures the public support and the approval of the war within the Russian society on a daily basis on extremely large samples. They do care. One of the indicators is the question of more mobilization. I mean, the Russian military has been pushing for another rounds of mobilization in order to address the manpower shortage. Some people in the Russian top elites are pushing for setting the Russian economy entirely on war footing. However, the Kremlin has been resisting staunchly, most probably because they are aware that the Russian population would not support another wave of mobilization or dedicating even more resources to the war. So yes, public support does matter, but not in the Western democratic sense. And from this perspective, to demonstrate to the Russian public that Russia is not alone C, North Korea is joining. Of course, there are pretty good jokes inside Russia about North Korea being a military ally and memes and everything. Still, the Russian propaganda is making a large story out of the North Korean contribution, much larger than it in reality is. And just one word about other countries possibly joining North Korea. It looks like that the trend is actually the opposite. Even India started to downscale military cooperation with Russia. And one needs to know, I mean, in India's in the weapon systems and armaments of the Indian army, ex-Soviet weaponry is represented at a really large scale. India started procuring Soviet weapons back in the Cold War period. They operate hundreds of ex-Soviet tanks, thousands of armored fighting vehicles, but now India started downscaling it, mostly because Russia turned out to be an extremely unreliable supplier. So Russia is not delivering the Sukhoi jets. Russia is not delivering the T-90S tanks promised. Fun fact, many of the T-90Ss promised to India and actually paid by India ended up in the Ukrainian front line. So Russia is prioritizing its needs. It needs the tanks more on the front line than for making India happy. So they are sending the tanks to the front line. And India, of course, is learning the lessons. So I do not see many countries that would follow the example of North Korea here. Thank you.
Thanks. That's very interesting. Over to you, Aylan.
Thank you. So to the China dependency question, I don't think, or it's been my impression that it has not really dawned on the majority of politicians in Germany yet, and political or sort of bureaucratic decision makers, with some exceptions, I would add. And I at least see a growing conversation occurring and taking place, which I think does have value in and of itself, because having a conversation and sort of pushing for that conversation continuously could lead to a growing realization that what happens, geographically speaking, very far away from home, could have a potentially catastrophic impact on Germany's well-being, stability, and security as well. And in terms of what kind of scenarios, I tried to highlight that earlier in my initial remarks. I think the Taiwan question is one, but the Philippines, which Evan has already alluded to earlier as well, is another scenario, which at least from my perspective seems to be more urgent at the very moment. But sort of both scenarios are both sort of countries involving a couple of different scenarios are those that we should be talking about, that we should be thinking about. And it could start, for example, with a blockade of Taiwan, which already could have serious consequences also for Europe. And I think those are the scenarios that we should, coming from a sort of think tank community or strategic community, be sort of trying to communicate to decision makers that there is a serious risk of that happening. Thus, to try to prevent that from happening, Germany should contribute by ways of deterrence to security and stability in that region. And because, if I may, Jan, you said that we could also react to our co-panelists to have also a sort of a conversation on the virtual stage. I would like to come back to what you, Evan, referred to as, I believe, overcrowdedness of activities in the region, which I totally subscribe to. Definitely, that's something that is happening. For example, sending a frigate for the sake of just sending something on Germany's part. And because also very important to bear in mind, and I think you alluded to that as well, because of US expectations. And while that may have been true and the case about 3 years ago, when Germany sends a frigate for the first time in about 20 or 25 years in 2021 to the region, my sense is that the perception of the importance of that region is, at least in some circles, especially in defense circles, in Germany, is growing, and that I think most people dealing with those issues in Germany are cognizant of the fact that those deployments are symbolic in nature. However, I would not underestimate the political value that those deployments may have. And on US expectations, those are being voiced on part of the US. Those expectations are very real, and German and US policymakers will tell you, yes, we do understand that it's symbolic and that Germany in a sort of a war or conflict case scenario could not contribute much in operational terms. And by the way, the same goes for France and the UK, although both claim to be global / Indo-Pacific powers. Nevertheless, at least that's my impression, my very sort of modest impression. I'm also talking to people in the US. It is being welcomed that countries like Germany are paying more attention to the region in sort of following the motto of the more eyes on the region, the better, in order to prevent something from happening.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alan. Let me pick up a question by Peter Linke.
Thank you very much for your input. This is a question for our colleague from the IISS. What's your perception of the coming Japan-South Korean defense industrial race, and how will it impact the multilateral security arrangements in the region? Thank you very much.
Evan, would you like to pick up this question?
Sure. Before I do that, let me quickly just respond a little bit to what Island said, because I think it's a very useful perspective. My impression, so I was in Berlin late last year, and I had these chats as well with some German policymakers. And my impression is you're absolutely right that the awareness of the importance of the region, I think, is certainly there and higher than compared to 3-4 years ago. The challenge now is to find a differentiating added value for Germany in this part of the world, right? And what you mentioned earlier in terms of defense industrial base development, capacity building, there's certainly room there to grow what you suggested in that sense, and not so much about changing the security or the strategic equation in terms of the flashpoints, whether it's Taiwan or the South China Sea, directly, but indirectly through a much more systematic and much more nuanced security assistance program and all of these things for Southeast Asia, whether it's the Philippines or others, and maybe not just the defense industrial base in hardware, but also software in terms of basic military reforms around personnel, doctrine, etc. I think there's huge value for Germany, but I don't get that sense that Germany, particularly the defense people, have come to the region and saying, here's why we're different from France and UK and others. And that's why it gets lost sometimes in the region. On the question about Japan and South Korea, that's actually quite fascinating, because I do get a sense talking to their defense industrial people, there is a sense of competition, although I think the South Koreans feel they're way ahead, and they're probably right in terms of export markets and technology and all of that. Japan, I think, is only now starting to readjust its policy infrastructure to do export. They're starting to have an official security assistance program and all of that, but they're still very, very small steps. When I saw some of the Japanese defense companies here in the region, they tend to say, look, we can only sell a certain amount of things without specific directions from Tokyo, from ATLA in particular. And so they're not at the same level yet as South Korea in that sense, but they do have something that the South Koreans do not have, which is a longer political and economic capital across the region that they've built since the 1960s and 70s. So in that sense, I think Japan is what me and my colleague used to say as a poor converter of strategic capital. They have all these strategic capital built over decades. Now they need to figure out, how do we transform this? How do we leverage this into something bigger, particularly on the defense side, is something that they haven't quite figured out. But multilaterally, I would say that Japan in particular is probably what I would consider as the top 3 or 2 dialogue partners for regional organizations like ASEAN here in Southeast Asia, China and Australia being the other 2. South Korea, I think diplomatically is a bit behind on its engagement with the region. I think they're trying to, but the trilateral arrangement I mentioned earlier with the United States, I think has taken a few leaps and bounds as opposed to the broader multilateral stuff on ASEAN. I think they try to do more on the Pacific as well, but it also feels quite tentative, if not tokenism, for the United States. So in that sense, I think for a very specific set of defense export and all of that, I think South Korea probably has an edge, although with Indonesia, there's some remaining problems. I think Japan has a broader set of strategic capital and platforms to engage beyond defense hardware that Japan hasn't really maximized yet.
Thanks, Evan. I don't currently see any other questions from the audience, so I'm going to throw in 1 or 2 of my own. One thing that you mentioned during your initial remarks, Evan, was something that I think you phrased, the return of army domination. And now we're not talking about what happened in South Korea domestically, specifically this past week, but here's a question that comes to mind, not just in East Asia, but in fact, across the globe, really, with the return of geopolitics, with the return of hard power politics, and the rising military equipment in many societies. Is there a danger of seeing military uprisings domestically in some of the countries that we talked about today? This is sort of a broad question out there. And one other thing that we didn't really talk about today, and given that the morning briefing will have to pause over the Christmas break over the next weeks, I was wondering, Andras, if you could give us an outlook of what to expect on the front line over the next weeks until the inauguration of the new US president. And as I'm looking to the chat, there's another question coming in by Christoph Waldersee about pointed to Evan. What would be the highest on the wish list from ASEAN states to Europe in concrete terms? Would it be a higher degree in economic engagement, for example, foreign direct investment, or more? So we've got a couple of questions and a few minutes left. So let me invite all of our panelists in the order in which they initially spoke to address the remaining questions and say any concluding remarks so we can finish on time. So let's start with Andras.
Thank you. Regarding the question what to expect on the front lines in the upcoming, let's say, 6 weeks, in short, more of the same, but a lot more. So Russia is optimizing on gaining as much territory before the Trump inauguration as possible, irrespective of the losses. So Russia is dictating an early and unseen operational tempo. They are trying to gain territories, particularly in the southern part of Ukraine, as well as in the Kursk region. In Kursk, Ukrainians are holding their lines firmly. Anyways, those are Ukraine's best units, and they have very beneficial defensive positions in Kursk. They are skillfully utilizing terrain characteristics. So Kursk is more or less stable. However, in the southern part of Ukraine, the front lines are moving. Russians are able to advance. I expect that by the Trump inauguration, Ukraine is going to lose much part of the southern part of the Donbas region, not Pokrovsk, but everything south of Pokrovsk. The question of Velika Novosilka, a key logistical hub close to the boundary of Donetsk and Zaporizhia region, is hanging in the air. Russians are really advancing in the southern part of the Donbas region. There seems to be no way to stop them firmly. The good news is that with kind of a month of delay, the rain season is finally starting. So the upcoming 2 weeks will bring a lot of rain with high temperature, so everything will turn into mud. This will slow down the Russian advance also in the south. So all in all, no strategic breakthrough, not even operational breakthrough. Grinding, slow Russian advance in the south. Meanwhile, Ukraine would be able to hold, hopefully, all the positions, both in the eastern front line and also in Kursk. Besides, Russia will keep attacking and degrading Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The situation is already very, very bad. Ukraine would need 18 gigawatts of energy for the winter week. Right now, they have the generation capacity only of 9 gigawatts, so half of what's needed. So large, lasting power outages is the best case scenario.
Thanks, Andras. Over to you, Evan. Question about ASEAN states and about military domination. Also, the question by Folk Mahachi that was just added in the chat about military dominance in many countries and its meaning for the strategic positioning in Southeast Asian countries, more autonomous or more cooperative, being to China. Over to you, Evan.
Thanks for those questions. First on the wish list, I think certainly much more on the econ and technology side as opposed to the security side. Econ being not just issues around palm oil stuff, but also trade and FDI. The technology piece certainly revolves around digital trade, data governance, emerging technology like AI, and all of those things. Kind of the wave of the future. A type of investment is certainly probably much an easier sell across Southeast Asia than the security side of the house. On the army domination, the interesting paradox I think across the region is, as you say, there is the return of hard power politics in terms of Ukraine, Gaza, and the concern around Taiwan and the South China Sea. It certainly does bring the security question much more visible. But because of the way that the army's worldview in this part of the world is very heavily skewed towards internal security, their expansive definition of security, everything can become a security problem, including food security. So in Indonesia, for example, one of the key programs of the new government is basically to create 100 battalion of food resilience units to support farming and fisheries and all of these things. And so it's actually a paradoxical sense, which is the return of the army does not bring more geopolitical awareness of external challenges. It's actually the reverse, which is they bring in much more internal security mindset to dominate domestic policy making and political system. And we also see this in the Philippines, despite what we see in terms of flashpoints and the directive to transition away from internal security to external defense. When I was in Manila 3-4 times over the past year, every single one of the army guys say, but we don't trust the police to handle internal security. So we still have to step in and do all of these things. So for me, the worry is that the security flashpoints that we see out there, South China Sea, Taiwan, Ukraine, Gaza, actually becomes a pretext for the army, a rationale for the army to actually be much more visible and be more present in domestic politics. And they expand the definition of security. In the Philippines, there's something called cognitive security now. And so everything becomes overly securitized in that sense. So for me, it's a paradoxical reaction.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating and worrying development. Thanks, Evan. Let me hand over to Aylan and raise two questions that we haven't raised so far: NATO and the upcoming German federal elections. So perhaps you could use your closing remarks, Aylan, to weave in those two factors as well.
Sure. I think, or it might not be a coincidence that we have not touched upon NATO so far, because the alliance does not have a unified approach towards the region, despite unified language and also toughened language with regards to China, as was apparent at the last summit in Washington, where China was actually very publicly and explicitly called an enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine, which obviously is the main concern, the security concern for NATO at the moment, but also for the foreseeable future. So despite the sort of changed mindset regarding China's role in European security, but also China's role more globally speaking, we don't have a single and unified voice on the region coming from Brussels. Yet NATO's role, and certainly the role of European NATO members vis-a-vis the region, may forcefully be elevated due to the incoming Trump administration. And I think it did not happen by chance that the new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has very publicly and very quite often during the last couple of weeks since he took office in early October, highlighted the linkages between both regions. And just as a side note, because we touched upon that earlier, just very briefly, the nuclear weapons program of North Korea. Mark Rutte has just said 1 or 2 days ago that he worries about Russia's involvement in advancing North Korea's nuclear weapons program without referring to where that intel came from. But nevertheless, I think that is something that we should also bear in mind with regard to the incoming Trump administration, but also the next German government. And I think one thing that I would recommend the next government here in Germany is to really realize that it is that how important it is to keep an eye on what is happening in China, and also making sure and also realizing that we may have a quote unquote China problem going into the future.
Thanks a lot, Aylin, and thanks also to Evan and Andras for joining us on the panel today. This was really insightful and fascinating. Thanks to people in the audience for tuning in and asking good questions, and thanks for being loyal to the German Council on Foreign Relations and making these morning briefings a full success. Have a lovely day and see you soon. Bye-bye.